very first of the British major film studios began its life in 1927, when John Maxwell started BNP.
The studio was built by a chap called J.D. Williams, who was an American producer who had produced Valentino and so on in Hollywood. And then he went back to America and went bust, or something happened to him. But anyway, and then John Maxwell took over this facility.
Although films had been in production since 1914 at Eldon Avenue, Elstree was the first state-of-the-art production facility.
Hitchcock was employed here, and so those early days of Elstree were extremely important because they were pioneering days. The first British sound talkie, the first colour musical, or the first multilingual film, and they had people from all over the world working here. They made the first French talking film here because the French didn't have the capacity to do it. So those early years were really groundbreaking.
The first episode covers the early history of the BNP years, until it was merged with ABPC, where the studios saw films like Dam Busters and the Cliff Richard movies, until the sale of the studios to EMI in 1969.
It was very, very top heavy, and therefore the studio went down because they couldn't afford to keep all these producers and things sitting around.
Those opening bars of the film score for ABPC's production, The Dam Busters, has become synonymous with a particular era of British film production, made at the company's own facilities in Elstree. Its state-of-the-art special effects were shot using the studio's water tank, which was also used to shoot parts of Moby Dick, released in 1956. This seemed preferable to attempting to drown Gregory Peck, the film's star, when they were shooting in Ireland.
Elstree was great, and it's not just being nostalgic, because I remember going back to the old days of MGM and Denham even, and Shepperton, which was always a shambles, but an amiable, cheerful shambles that filmmakers ran. And Elstree was a good compromise between a proper studio and a filmmaker's studio.
In 1955, my father, Andrew Mitchell's life became inextricably linked with this icon of British film production, as he joined the staff as a trainee executive.
He's one of those people in our industry who I feel has always been there, but I suppose it must have been somewhere, and I never think of Andy anywhere other than at Elstree.
He loved the studios. He was completely a film person.
He spent a couple of years of tedium before actually being given a practical role in the productions.
He had just started. He had been with Elstree about 2 or 3 months only, so he was a novice. He was a trainee, really. Didn't really know what was going to happen to him, but he was trainee. What's they called again? Because it was producer, I suppose. Yeah, something like that. Because in Norway, when we got married, 2 months later, a friend of mine was a journalist, and he had photographers waiting outside the church where we were we got married, and they took photos of us coming out, and they called him executive film trainee or something like that, and I had no idea what that meant. Absolutely.
19 years later, he replaced Ian Scott as managing director during the studio's most turbulent period in 1974. In this little series, we explore the studio's history from that time, but as with most projects of this kind, it's time to sketch out a little of the facility's earlier history. By the way, a quick warning, I may switch from referring to my father as Mitchell and Andrew Mitchell, just to make it sound slightly formal, like a proper documentary. So in 1914, the Neptune Film Company created the first film studios in Boreham Wood, built in Eldon Avenue. Why in Elstree, one might ask? Well, it had less smog than London and wasn't as noisy. So in the crystal skies of Boreham Wood, this short-lived venture ceased production in the penultimate year of World War I. Up to 1913, Britain's fledgling industry was the most successful in exporting its films, especially in Latin America. But the World War dealt a blow to the export market that left the business struggling for several years, and production ceased in 1917. Anyway, the premises was eventually bought by the Ideal Film Company. Sounds a bit like a sort of manufacturer of double glazing. It eventually became the site of ATV television, and finally went on to become the BBC Studios that is mainly occupied by Cockney Sparrows from RADA. In the meantime, BNP, British National Pictures, not to be confused with certain repugnant political organisations, made its plans to dominate the UK film industry and purchased 40 acres of land on the sunny south side of this glamorous location at Shenley Road. 2 large film stages began construction in 1925, and this embryonic facility became Elstree Film Studios, with its first film, Madame Pompadour, in 1927. Then, as if by commerce, the studios had the first of its many managerial transitions when Scottish solicitor John Maxwell, who renamed the company the imaginatively titled British International Pictures, BIP, and bought the studios in 1928. Taking over the ABC Film Theatres, the studio's next seminal event was the first acknowledged British feature with a soundtrack in 1929. Alfred Hitchcock's Blackmail. Then, in 1933, BIP became the Associated British Picture Corporation.
When Chaplin visited here in about 1933, he coined the phrase the Hollywood of England, because by then, not only did we have Elstree Studios here, we had the original studios in Boreham Wood across the road, which opened as Neptune in 1914, and we had the Gate Studios up by the station, that opened in 1928, and next door to Elstree we had the British and Dominion Studios, Imperial Studios, which opened in 1930. So even by the early 30s we had 4 different film studios in the town.
After Maxwell's death in October 1940, the Maxwell family remained the largest shareholders and were able to exercise a measure of control. But the studio at Elstree was taken over by the government for the duration of the war, and film production was restricted to B pictures that featured people like Ronald Reagan, made at the company's smaller studios in Welwyn Garden City. This studio complex closed in 1950. Fellow Scot Robert Clark became head of production at ABPC in the late 1940s and 1950s. It was a successful time for the company, and the film, including our opening peg, The Dam Busters, was made in 1955. Clark was removed from his position as head of production in January 1958, and after a series of clashes with Warner Brothers that had gained control following Maxwell's death, was replaced by C.J. Latter.
And they turned down things like The Great Escape, because who wants to see another war film? At that time, that's what their thoughts were on that. And they turned down Dr. No, because they said a British Secret Service agent wouldn't go well in the American market. So why would we back a film about that? So we can sit here smug now and say these people were idiots, but they were of that period.
During this period, my father was involved as a producer on a number of different ABPC pictures, including the diabolical trinity of Cliff Richard films, The Young Ones, Summer Holiday and Wonderful Life.
Young ones, darling, we're the young ones.
If you really wanted to know what was going on and where we were shooting and what was happening, you went to Andrew because he was the only one that really knew. Herb Ross has a good point, came over from America, thought we were all lunatics, he'd never seen anything like this in action, and was well on his way back to London Airport, and Andrew was the one that sort of rushed after and said, come back, give us a chance. Said, we're ready, tell us what you want us to do and we'll do it, because I couldn't believe what was happening.
All going on a summer holiday, no more working for a
We went on location to Lake Marathon, which is 2 hours from Athens, and there was a cafe there, and there was a lake, and of course the Marathon Lake. And then Cliff Richard was singing and dancing with this girl, Peters, I think she was something Peters, and then I was dressed as a waitress in a kind of Swiss costume, and I had huge long plaits, they were beautiful. And then I came on with a tray with drinks, and this was for Cliff and
We'll share a few laughs. Wonderful life. Do all the things that you do in your dreams, and you see it's so wonderful.
What actually happened was we had another story which would have been very, very good, was known as the Mexican story. And in this particular story, Cliff is a guardsman, and he receives a call to come to Mexico because his uncle has died and he's supposed to go to Mexico to settle his estate. And he comes to Mexico and he gets on a Mexican train and he is riding up to settle his uncle's affairs. And suddenly he's looking out of the window and some bandits come by, pull him out of the train, put a blindfold on him, put him on he's riding off, doesn't know where he is. Finally, after hours of riding, they stop the horse and they pull the blindfold off him, and he is in the middle of hundreds of Mexican bandits who all hail him, shouting "El sombrero, el sombrero," and he finds out that his uncle was a big bandit chief, and he's supposed to be inheriting that was the basis, so we always call it the Mexican. So, and actually they did some location hunting out there, but by the time we wanted to go, the weather was wrong. So that was junked, and we did this Wonderful Life, which I didn't think was anywhere near there, but we all know it was nowhere near as good as the other two.
Once a jolly swagman, once upon a time.
when he was sitting in the pub and they were talking about the Beatles, they didn't mention the Shadows at all, and he thought, this sounds very interesting, Rob. And he went to Leslie Grade and said, how about the Beatles? Have you heard about them? And Leslie said, well, I think the Shadows are much bigger or greater.
I remember your dad was involved with MGM, Up Jumped a Swagman with Frank Ifield, which was shot up there, and I think he was keen on the Beatles as a concept of linking them in somehow before they did It's a Hard Day's Night and so on. Of course, then everything became a different world, but didn't manage to get that to go.
You enjoy the movies, like to know what the stars do on and off the set. It's good to know what's new. Then read all about it in the ABC Film Review. Correct those colored pin-ups.
But then, Clark was appointed Chief Executive and Deputy Chairman of ABPC, a position he retained until the takeover of the group by EMI in 1969, a move fiercely opposed by Clark and most of the fellow directors. Like many of his fellow executives, my father found himself working as a freelancer following the EMI takeover. He worked on several pictures as a producer and then completion guarantor, but his greatest disappointment was in the 3 Fred Zinnemann films which never came to fruition. One title in particular, Man's Fate, gave a great insight to observers as to the way film production in the UK was going. With Kirk Kerkorian selling and then later rebuying and then selling and then later rebuying and then selling and then later rebuying MGM, and films like Ryan's Daughter running into extended shooting whilst waiting for the right kind of rain, David Lean taking his cue from British Rail, sadly with disappointed box office returns. Fighting off television, the whole industry was suffering economic uncertainty, and the British studios owned by American companies like MGM were now fighting for continued existence. Man's Fate was one of the more famous casualties of this series of events.
October 23rd. Crisis Day, with the news from the US of the cancellation of the film. The size of our budget will get MGM off the hook. FZ spoke to Ponte and MGM. Both said submit a smaller $10 million budget. Then we'll wait for a new board to be appointed. October 24th. Everyone is a bit touchy. The film really is in the balance. It depends on the budget. We must get it down to 10 million. October 29th. I gave MGM and all concerned a budget under 10 million, so they can't fault us on that. October 30th. Producing as usual. Tension high.
The budget was going up too fast, and there was a kind of a financial crisis about it, which worried particularly the people at MGM at the studio, who had a number of very expensive productions going at the same time.
It was a kind of marker. It showed that the American companies, like Paramount and United Artists and MGM and Universal, which had been very active in financing British filmmaking during the 60s, were going back and spending the money on their own stars, their own themes, their own writers, and their own film directors.
During this period, my father worked on 4 movies. The camp but dowdy Best Pair of Legs in the Business.
Here to make your evening merry. Share your song and dance, man. Why, that's not the London Palladium.
The laborious and torturous and ultimately uncredited, as far as my father was concerned, because he was asked to come back and do another picture with Fred Zinnemann, which didn't happen. Murphy's War, which starred as starring Peter O'Toole. He also worked on the film version of Please Sir. This, of course, was at a time when British films thought, if we can't think of anything original, we'll just stick some sitcom on celluloid.
If we commit ourselves, and if one kid responds, that's all it takes. One child...
That was my first experience of making a major film, a full film, as against a television film. And it was a great help to me, enormous help, because I was really in the state where you walk into the studio and you say, all this equipment, which is I'm not used to, television equipment I'm used to, but not cinema equipment. And the dilemma that faces a director is, does he actually say roll them like you see in the Hollywood movies? We were just a unit which had been working in the television studio, and then we were sort of dumped on Andrew as a bunch, as a sort of working team, which had problems for him in a way, because we were all used to each other and he wasn't, which is one of the marvellous things, how well he fitted in. He was, in a way, coming into an exercise which already existed. And that was where he was awfully good. He was the only film man on it at all. I mean, he had I perhaps shouldn't say it, but he had another man who was working in cooperation with him, who was supplied by the London Weekend, who also, as a sort of co-producer, who really had no idea, didn't know anything about film at all. And that was a bit of a burden for him. I won't mention any names, but he knows who I mean.
And finally, the slightly raucous and somewhat dubious transference of the fast Don't Just Lie There, Say Something, which was a very successful stage play, into a less successful film.
We'll get you away. No, please, I'll get caught in
The assistant director, Ted Lewis, would summon Joanna Lumley, and he said, right, up at the desk, darling, come on, you toffee-nosed bitch, get him off. And she said, oh, Ted, you really mustn't talk to me like that. I'm not a toffee-nosed bitch at all. So yes, you are. I said, go on, get him off. I said, he said, well, can't I keep anything on? I said, yes, you can keep on your pants and you keep on your bra. I said, but I want everything else off. You've got to get this body makeup on. There's no time to waste. So Andrew would move over a bit, sticking firmly behind his paper. Joanna would climb up onto the desk, strip off, in full view of the solicitors all going by in Chancery Lane, coming up our little bit of Bream's buildings at the side, and have her body makeup put on, complaining with a cup of coffee in one hand about the general indignities of it all. Brian Ricks and the others would be appearing up Chancery Lane again, generally in underpants and a policeman's helmet or something equally. And all this going on at rush hour, of course, when all the legal profession was turning up for work. Well, it did cause quite a stir, but no complaints.
Don't just like that, say something.
Meanwhile, back at EMI...
Yes, I did direct her slightly, as much as I was allowed to. I adore her. No, she takes direction.
The brief period of management by actor and director Brian Forbes since ABPC's takeover led to several productions.
The script, you don't know what it is. Unless you're Big Dakin, tell him, somebody, tell him.
He's a nutter. He's a psychopath.
Who are you looking at?
You are looking at the face of a villain.
Some of which did actually recoup costs and succeed in the UK.
And we were very lucky then because Brian Forbes was head of production and he had an absolute passion for it.
But failed to gain much attention worldwide, and certainly did not create enough confidence for EMI to invest heavily in further film production.
It could have been a great enterprise, but I'm afraid there was so much chicanery going on behind the scenes, which is sad because in many ways it revitalised a very ailing British film industry at the time, and I made 18 negatives there for £4 million.
Good God. Good.
And some of them were very successful. I mean, Railway Children to this day.
Good.
The Go-Between.
Yes.
Tales of Beatrix Potter.
Yes.
There were several very good films there which I inaugurated, and several which were thrown to the wolves. They just wouldn't support me.
Possibly frustrated by the limited ambitions of EMI's board and the turmoil in US companies typified by the MGM takeover, it led to Forbes relinquishing his position in 1972. And he was replaced by Ian Scott.
Ian, over the years, became financial controller and then went on to become managing director. And that's who I stayed working for until 1973, when he left and Andrew came.
My father, who never much enjoyed the instability of freelance life, working as executive producer and completion guarantor and other roles, was then approached by EMI to take up what he thought was his dream job, returning to the studio he loved as its managing director. But as is often the case in life, things were not quite all as he hoped. His first instruction was to lay off half the staff and then later in the year to close the studios. It looked as if it was going to be the shortest appointment ever, as he was cast in the unenviable role of Hatchet Man.